when General Nathaniel Blackstone ordered Lieutenant Diana Foster to report to his office at Fort Meridian at precisely 600 hours. She knew her carefully maintained cover was about to be tested in ways she never anticipated. What she didn't expect was for him to grab a pair of military-issue scissors and hack off her regulation-length chestnut hair as punishment for what he called insubordination and conduct unbecoming. But as those severed locks fell to the polished floor of his office, neither of them realized that this single act of petty cruelty would uncover a secret so explosive it would silence the entire Redrock Military Installation within 48 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air at Redrock carried the sharp bite of Nevada desert winter, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. The installation sprawled across 45,000 acres of high desert terrain, its runways stretching toward the Sierra Nevada mountains that loomed like ancient sentinels against the star-punctured sky. F-35 Lightning fighters sat in precise formations on the tarmac, their stealth surfaces gleaming under the mercury vapor lights, while transport aircraft and aerial refueling tankers filled the auxiliary fields. This was home to the 412th Advanced Tactical Wing, one of the Air Force's most elite combat units, and every person on base understood they were part of something extraordinary. Lieutenant Diana Foster walked across the main parade ground with the measured pace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. At 29, she was unremarkable by design. Average height, average build, her chestnut brown hair pulled back in the standard military bun that revealed nothing of the precision with which she arranged it each morning. Her uniform was the standard-issue airman battle uniform in the familiar digital camouflage pattern, clean and pressed, but showing the wear patterns of someone who actually worked for a living rather than merely appearing at ceremonial functions. The only unusual thing about her appearance was the complete absence of unit patches, rank insignia, or name tapes that would normally identify her role on base. Where other airmen displayed their squadron emblems, their career field badges, their accumulated ribbons and decorations, Diana's uniform was sterile, anonymous. To the casual observer, she might have been a transient, someone passing through between assignments, or perhaps a civilian contractor who hadn't yet received her proper credentials. This anonymity was carefully cultivated and absolutely essential to her survival. She moved through the base like a ghost, present but unnoticed, familiar but not memorable. The security guards at the main gate knew her face well enough to wave her through without checking her identification, but they couldn't have told you her name or her job if their careers depended on it. The airmen in the dining facility served her meals with professional courtesy, but no recognition. The administrative clerks processed her routine paperwork with efficient indifference. She existed in the spaces between attention, in the gaps where military bureaucracy lost track of individual human beings. This morning was different, though. This morning she had been summoned. The summons had come through official channels, a formal written order delivered to her quarters by a stone-faced master sergeant who refused to meet her eyes. "General Blackstone wants to see you," he had said, his voice carrying the peculiar mixture of respect and unease that people developed when they sensed they were dealing with something outside their understanding. "Oh, 600 hours. Don't be late." Diana had read the order 3 times, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. General Nathaniel Blackstone was the base commander, a man whose reputation preceded him like the shockwave from a supersonic aircraft. He was known for his iron discipline, his intolerance for anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of military excellence, and his particular disdain for what he called special snowflakes. personnel who operated outside normal command structures or who seemed to believe their roles exempted them from standard military courtesy. The problem was that Diana fell squarely into that category, though for reasons that Blackstone couldn't possibly understand. Her official records, the ones that any base commander would have access to, listed her as a cybersecurity specialist, grade E3, assigned to the 412th Communications Squadron for routine network maintenance and user support. Her security clearance was listed as secret, standard for someone who might occasionally handle classified equipment, but who wasn't trusted with anything truly sensitive. Her performance evaluations were consistently average, good enough to avoid negative attention, not outstanding enough to warrant special recognition. On paper, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent but unremarkable technician, doing a necessary but unglamorous job. The reality was far more complex, buried beneath 9 layers of classification, accessible only to a handful of people, with need-to-know authorization and compartmented clearances that existed in databases so secure they didn't officially exist. Her true identity was classified beyond the reach of conventional military hierarchy. She was not Lieutenant Diana Foster, cybersecurity specialist. She was Major Diana Foster, United States Space Force, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Quantum Warfare Division, Project Shadow Strike. As Diana approached the headquarters building, she felt the familiar weight of maintaining her dual existence. She had to be careful not to walk too purposefully, not to show the situational awareness that 20 months of covert operations had ingrained in her. She had to remember to fumble slightly with her identification card at the security checkpoint, to show just enough uncertainty about the building's layout to seem like someone who rarely visited the command section. She had to be Diana Foster, cybersecurity specialist, not Major Foster, quantum warfare officer. The headquarters building rose before her like a monument to military authority, its facade of tan concrete and mirrored glass reflecting the pre-dawn sky. Inside, she knew General Blackstone was waiting with whatever grievance had prompted this early morning summons. He would see what he expected to see, a junior enlisted airman who had somehow stepped out of line and needed correction. He would never imagine that he was about to confront one of the most dangerous people on his base, someone whose true capabilities could reshape the balance of power in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. As Diana climbed the steps to the main entrance, she had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, her carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered forever, and that the simple act of a general's petty cruelty would trigger a chain of events that would force her to reveal capabilities that were supposed to remain buried in the deepest levels of military classification. The automatic doors slid open with a soft pneumatic whisper, and Diana stepped inside to face whatever General Blackstone had in store for her, carrying her secret like a loaded weapon that no one suspected existed. The headquarters building's interior reflected the same stark efficiency as its exterior, polished marble floors that echoed with the measured footsteps of military personnel, walls lined with portraits of distinguished commanders dating back to the installation's founding in 1952, and the omnipresent smell of industrial cleaning solutions mixed with the ozone scent of high-tech electronics. Redrock Military Installation was more than just another Air Force base. It was the nerve center for some of the most advanced aerospace operations in the world, a facility where the boundaries between science fiction and military reality blurred on a daily basis. The 412th Advanced Tactical Wing didn't just fly aircraft. They tested prototypes that wouldn't enter service for another decade, evaluated systems so classified that their very existence was compartmented beyond the reach of congressional oversight, and trained pilots for missions that the public would never know about. The base sprawled across terrain that had once been considered worthless. High desert scrubland where nothing grew except sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree. But that isolation was precisely what made it valuable. Redrock was surrounded by restricted airspace that extended for hundreds of miles in every direction, protected by electronic countermeasures that could detect and neutralize threats long before they became visible to the naked eye. Diana made her way through corridors that hummed with barely contained energy. Behind unmarked doors, she knew, teams of engineers and technicians worked on projects that pushed the absolute limits of human understanding. Hypersonic flight systems that could circle the globe in under 2 hours. Directed energy weapons that could disable enemy satellites from the ground. Communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement, immune to any form of conventional interception or jamming. The people who walked these halls represented the cutting edge of military science and technology. Physicists with security clearances higher than some cabinet members, test pilots who routinely flew aircraft that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics, intelligence analysts who processed information gathered by sensors so sophisticated they could read license plates from orbit. Yet for all its technological sophistication, Redrock operated according to the same rigid hierarchy that had governed military organizations for centuries. Rank mattered, protocol mattered. The chain of command was absolute, and anyone who forgot their place in that chain quickly found themselves reassigned to less prestigious positions at less important installations. This was the world that General Nathaniel Blackstone ruled with absolute authority. His domain extended over 12,000 military and civilian personnel, a budget that exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations, and responsibilities that included some of the most sensitive national security operations in existence. He was the kind of officer who had dedicated his entire adult life to understanding and mastering the complex machinery of military command. Diana passed the portraits of previous base commanders, each one representing a different era in Redrock's evolution from a simple fighter base to a facility that housed capabilities most people couldn't imagine. General Patricia Hawthorne, who had overseen the transition to stealth technology in the 1980s, General Michael Rodriguez, who had established the first space warfare training programs in the 1990s, General Sarah Kim, who had integrated artificial intelligence systems into combat operations during the early 2000s. Each commander had faced the challenge of managing technologies that were advancing faster than military doctrine could adapt. Each had dealt with personnel whose capabilities sometimes exceeded their own understanding. Each had learned that in the modern military, the most dangerous assumptions were the ones about what was possible and who was capable of achieving it. The elevator that carried Diana to the command level was equipped with biometric scanners that verified her identity at multiple points during the 30-second journey. Her fingerprints, retinal patterns, and even her gait were analyzed by systems that maintained databases on every person authorized to access the building's upper floors. To the security systems, she was exactly what her records indicated: Lieutenant Diana Foster, cybersecurity specialist, authorized for routine administrative access, but nothing more. The reality was that those same systems had been monitoring her for 20 months without ever detecting the sophisticated countermeasures she employed to mask her true activities. The biometric scanners read the false data that quantum encrypted implants provided. The behavioral analysis programs interpreted her carefully modulated responses as those of someone with standard secret-level clearances, rather than someone whose actual authorization exceeded that of most general officers. As the elevator doors opened onto the command level, Diana felt the weight of her dual existence more acutely than ever. She was walking into the office of a man who believed he understood every aspect of his command, carrying secrets that would revolutionize his understanding of what was possible within the modern military. The collision between his assumptions and her reality was about to reshape everything he thought he knew about command, authority, and the true nature of the personnel under his supervision. The command level bustled with activity even at this early hour. Staff officers moved between briefing rooms where classified operations were planned and coordinated. Communication specialists maintained contact with military units around the world. Intelligence analysts processed streams of data that arrived through channels so secure that acknowledging their existence required presidential authorization. This was the heart of Redrock's operations, the place where decisions were made that affected global military strategy. And somewhere in this maze of classified activity, General Blackstone was waiting to deliver what he believed would be a simple lesson in military discipline to a subordinate who had forgotten her place in the hierarchy. Diana approached his office with the same measured pace that had characterized her every movement for the past 20 months. Behind her unremarkable exterior, beneath her carefully maintained anonymity, lay capabilities that could disable every system in the building with a few keystrokes. But those capabilities remained hidden, protected by psychological conditioning and operational security protocols that had been designed to ensure they were never revealed unless absolutely necessary. As she reached the outer office where General Blackstone's aide waited to announce her arrival, Diana had no way of knowing that necessity was only minutes away, and that the carefully constructed walls between her cover identity and her true capabilities were about to be shattered by an act of petty authority that would expose secrets never meant to see daylight at Redrock Military Installation. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez looked up from her computer terminal as Diana approached the reception desk outside General Blackstone's office. At 34, Martinez had served as the general's administrative aide for 3 years, long enough to develop an almost supernatural ability to read the mood and intentions of officers who requested meetings with the base commander. She had seen ambitious majors seeking promotion, nervous captains reporting security breaches, and confident colonels presenting operational proposals. But something about Lieutenant Foster struck her as different. "Lieutenant Foster reporting as ordered, Sergeant," Diana announced, presenting her identification card with the precise military courtesy that had become second nature after 20 months of maintaining her cover identity. Martinez examined the card briefly, though she had already verified Diana's appointment through multiple channels. The general's calendar showed a 0600 meeting with Lieutenant Foster, Communications Squadron Disciplinary Counseling. The notation was unusual. Most disciplinary issues were handled at squadron level or through the first sergeant's office. For General Blackstone to personally conduct corrective counseling suggested either an exceptional breach of military standards or some other factor that Martinez couldn't identify. "The general will see you momentarily," Martinez said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged in the waiting area. "He's finishing a secure call with Peterson Space Force Base." Diana took a seat facing the closed door to Blackstone's inner office, using the opportunity to conduct the kind of environmental assessment that had become automatic after years of intelligence training. The outer office was a study in military efficiency and personal achievement. Martinez's desk displayed the organized chaos of someone managing complex schedules for a senior officer, classified briefing folders arranged by priority, secure communication devices that connected to networks spanning the globe, and computer monitors showing real-time status updates from various base operations. The walls showcased the general's career progression through a series of photographs and commendations. Flight school graduation from 1995, squadron command ceremonies from Iraq and Afghanistan, joint staff assignments at the Pentagon. Each image captured a moment in the evolution of an officer who had dedicated his life to understanding and mastering the instruments of military power. Behind Martinez's desk, a bank of monitors displayed current base operations, flight schedules for the test squadrons, maintenance status for aircraft that officially didn't exist, communication traffic flowing between Redrock and military installations around the world, weather data from sensors positioned throughout the restricted airspace surrounding the facility. To an outsider, it might have appeared to be routine administrative information. To Diana, it represented a comprehensive overview of vulnerabilities she had spent months mapping and analyzing. The secure phone on Martinez's desk chirped softly, indicating an incoming call on one of the classified networks that connected Redrock to the broader defense establishment. She answered with practiced efficiency, speaking in the coded language that military communications specialists used when discussing sensitive operations over channels that might be monitored by foreign intelligence services. General Blackstone's office, Staff Sergeant Martinez speaking. Yes, sir. He's available for the 0630 briefing. The Nighthawk squadron status is uploaded to the secure server. No, sir. There are no changes to today's flight operations schedule. Diana listened to the conversation while maintaining the appearance of someone waiting patiently for a routine meeting. Her training had included extensive instruction in gathering intelligence from seemingly innocent administrative communications, and Martinez's responses provided valuable confirmation of operational patterns Diana had identified during her infiltration mission. The Nighthawk Squadron was Redrock's most classified unit, responsible for testing aircraft and systems so advanced that their existence was compartmented beyond the reach of congressional oversight. Diana's mission parameters included mapping the squadron's capabilities and identifying vulnerabilities in their operational security. The casual reference to flight schedules and status reports suggested that even General Blackstone's administrative staff had access to information that most military personnel would never be cleared to see. Through the closed door of the inner office, Diana could hear the muffled sound of General Blackstone's voice as he conducted his secure call with Peterson Space Force Base. The conversation appeared to involve coordination for joint operations between Redrock and the military's space warfare units, another area of increasing importance that Diana's superiors were eager to understand and potentially compromise. Martinez completed her call and returned to the administrative tasks that kept a senior officer's schedule functioning smoothly. Diana observed the efficiency with which she managed multiple communication channels simultaneously. Secure phones, classified computer networks, and routine base communication systems, all operating in coordination to ensure that General Blackstone had access to whatever information he needed at any given moment. "Lieutenant," Martinez said, without looking up from her computer screen, "may I ask what squadron you're assigned to? I don't recall seeing your name on any of the recent personnel rosters I've processed." The question was routine, the kind of small talk that administrative personnel used to fill awkward silences while visitors waited for meetings. But Diana recognized it as exactly the sort of inquiry that could expose inconsistencies in her cover identity if not handled carefully. "For 12th Communications Squadron," Diana replied. "Network security and maintenance. I've been here about 20 months, but most of my work is behind the scenes. Equipment maintenance, system updates, that sort of thing. Not the kind of assignments that usually come to command attention." It was a perfectly crafted response that acknowledged Martinez's question while reinforcing the image of someone whose duties were too mundane to merit detailed scrutiny. The mention of her length of service established credibility, while the description of her work explained why she might not be familiar to someone who processed personnel matters for the base commander. Martinez nodded absently, apparently satisfied with the explanation. She had no way of knowing that Diana's actual duties during those 20 months had included activities that would have triggered the highest levels of security alerts if detected. The routine maintenance work she described was real. It provided perfect cover for the intelligence gathering and system penetration that constituted her true mission. The secure phone chirped again, this time with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from within the Pentagon's most classified communication networks. Martinez answered with even greater formality than before. General Blackstone's office, Staff Sergeant Martinez. Yes, ma'am, he's expecting your call. I'll transfer you immediately to the secure line. She pressed a series of buttons that connected the call directly to General Blackstone's office. Bypassing the normal administrative protocols, Diana recognized the procedure as one used for communications that were too sensitive to risk even momentary exposure to routine base networks. Through the closed door, she could hear the general's voice take on the tone that military officers used when speaking with superiors whose rank or authority exceeded their own. The conversation was brief, lasting perhaps 3 minutes, but Diana could sense the tension even through the heavy door that separated the outer office from the inner sanctum, where General Blackstone conducted his most sensitive business. When the call ended, the silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of aircraft operations from the flight line. Martinez returned to her paperwork, but Diana noticed a subtle change in her demeanor, the kind of increased alertness that administrative personnel developed when they sensed that their immediate superiors were dealing with situations that might affect the entire command structure. The inner office door opened with the sharp precision that characterized all of General Blackstone's actions. He appeared in the doorway as a commanding presence that seemed to fill the available space. 6'1", of military bearing refined through decades of command experience. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, his expression set in the neutral mask that senior officers wore when they were about to deliver consequences that subordinates wouldn't enjoy. "Lieutenant Foster," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Report to my office. Immediately." Diana rose from her chair and followed him into the inner sanctum, where whatever grievance had prompted this meeting would be addressed according to General Blackstone's understanding of military justice and disciplinary procedure. She carried her secret like a weapon concealed beneath layers of carefully maintained anonymity, unaware that in minutes it would be exposed by an act of casual cruelty that would reshape everything both of them understood about authority, power, and the true capabilities of the personnel under military command. General Nathaniel Blackstone's office was a monument to 3 decades of military achievement and an unwavering belief in the power of traditional military hierarchy. The corner office occupied prime real estate on the command level, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Redrock's primary flight line, where F-35 Lightning fighters and experimental aircraft sat in precise formations like sleeping predators waiting for their next mission. At 52, Blackstone embodied everything the Air Force considered leadership material. His steel-gray hair was cut to regulation perfection, not a strand out of place despite the early morning hour. His pale green eyes had the calculating intensity of someone who had spent years making decisions that affected thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in military hardware. His 6'1" frame carried the bearing of an officer who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of discipline, proper procedure, and unwavering adherence to the chain of command. The office reflected his worldview with museum-like precision. Behind his mahogany desk, an American flag stood alongside the Air Force flag and the distinctive banner of the 412th Advanced Tactical Wing. The walls displayed a carefully curated collection of photographs, documenting a career that read like a textbook on military excellence. Squadron command ceremonies from deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, joint training exercises with NATO allies, meetings with defense secretaries and senior Pentagon officials. Each image captured a moment in the evolution of an officer who had dedicated his life to mastering the complex machinery of modern military power. His desk was arranged with geometric precision that would have impressed a Swiss clockmaker. Challenge coins from various units and operations were displayed in perfect rows, each one representing a mission completed or a command position held with distinction. A leather-bound calendar showed appointments scheduled down to the minute. Secure communication devices provided direct access to military networks spanning the globe. Everything in the office reinforced the message that this was a place where important decisions were made by someone who understood the weight of command responsibility. The bookshelf behind his chair contained volumes that revealed his approach to leadership and military strategy. Classic texts on air power theory by Billy Mitchell and John Boyd, modern analyses of joint operations and asymmetric warfare, biographies of legendary military commanders from George Patton to Norman Schwarzkopf. These weren't decorative accessories but working references that Blackstone consulted regularly when developing strategies and making decisions that affected base operations. To Blackstone's mind, the military was a precision instrument that functioned according to clearly defined principles. Hierarchy mattered because it established accountability and ensured that orders flowed efficiently from senior commanders to junior personnel. Discipline mattered because it created the mental framework that allowed military organizations to function under extreme stress. Protocol mattered because it prevented confusion and miscommunication that could prove fatal in combat situations. Personnel who operated outside these established frameworks represented potential points of failure that needed to be identified and corrected before they could compromise unit effectiveness. The intelligence specialists with their compartmented clearances, the special operations personnel with their classified missions, the technical experts who seemed to operate by their own rules. They were necessary components of modern military operations, but they required careful management to ensure they didn't forget their place in the larger organizational structure. Blackstone had built his reputation on identifying problem personnel and either molding them to fit proper military standards or removing them from positions where their non-conformity could affect unit cohesion. His methods were old school but effective: direct confrontation, immediate consequences, and the kind of public correction that left no doubt about command expectations. Officers and enlisted personnel throughout Redrock understood that General Blackstone's standards were non-negotiable, and that failing to meet those standards would result in swift and memorable correction. The incident that had brought Lieutenant Foster to his attention represented exactly the kind of attitude problem that Blackstone had spent his career eliminating. 3 days earlier, during a routine inspection of the communications squadron, he had encountered her working alone in the main server room at a terminal, displaying what appeared to be diagnostic information. When he had approached and demanded to know what she was doing, her response had been textbook military courtesy, respectful, precise, and technically accurate. But something about her manner had struck him as fundamentally wrong. She had answered his questions without hesitation, explaining that she was conducting routine network maintenance, updating security protocols, and verifying system integrity. Her explanations were complete, professional, and delivered with the kind of technical competence that should have impressed any commanding officer. Instead, they had triggered his instinct for detecting subordinates who believed they were somehow above normal military courtesy. There had been something in her tone, a subtle quality that suggested she was talking down to him, rather than providing the deferential responses that military protocol required. When he had pressed for more detailed explanations of her work, she had provided them readily, using technical terminology that was accurate but unnecessarily complex. It was the kind of response pattern that Blackstone associated with personnel who used their specialized knowledge as a shield against legitimate command authority. The more he had questioned her, the more convinced he became that Lieutenant Foster represented exactly the kind of problem that could metastasize throughout his command if not addressed decisively. She was too comfortable, too confident, too ready with explanations that demonstrated her technical competence while subtly suggesting that his questions revealed his own limitations. It was insubordination wrapped in the language of military courtesy, the kind of passive resistance that clever subordinates used when they thought they could outsmart their superiors. Colonel Patricia Valdez, his deputy commander for operations, had tried to dissuade him from taking corrective action. She had reviewed Foster's personnel file and found nothing that justified disciplinary intervention. Performance evaluations consistently satisfactory, no documented problems with attitude or military bearing, supervisors who reported no issues with her work or her interaction with other personnel. But Blackstone trusted his instincts more than paperwork. 30 years of military service had taught him to recognize the warning signs when personnel began to believe that their technical expertise exempted them from normal military discipline. Foster's supervisors were technical specialists themselves, more concerned with network functionality than military bearing. They wouldn't recognize attitude problems if those problems didn't directly affect system performance. The truth was that Blackstone had never fully trusted the technical branches of the Air Force. In his worldview, real airmen flew aircraft, maintained aircraft, or supported the people who flew aircraft. Everyone else, the communications specialists, the intelligence analysts, the cyber warfare officers, represented a necessary but potentially problematic dilution of the service's core mission. They were important for modern operations, but they often forgot that they were military personnel first and technicians second. This morning's corrective action would serve multiple purposes. It would remind Lieutenant Foster of her place in the military hierarchy. It would demonstrate to other personnel that technical competence didn't exempt anyone from proper military courtesy, and it would reinforce the principle that command authority extended to every aspect of military service, including personal appearance and attitude toward superiors. The plan was simple and well within his authority as base commander. Military grooming standards existed for important reasons. They promoted unit cohesion, eliminated potential sources of favoritism or special treatment, and ensured that all personnel understood they were part of something larger than their individual preferences. Foster's hair length was technically within regulations, but it represented the maximum permitted length. Combined with her apparent attitude problem, it provided a perfect opportunity to deliver a lesson that would benefit not just her, but anyone else who might be tempted to test the boundaries of military discipline. As Diana entered his office and assumed the position of attention, Blackstone felt the satisfaction that came from addressing problems before they could spread throughout his command. He had no way of knowing that the quiet lieutenant standing before him carried security clearances that exceeded his own, that her true mission was classified beyond his ability to access, or that what he was about to do would trigger a demonstration of capabilities that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of military authority and the personnel under his command. Diana Foster stood at attention 3 feet from General Blackstone's desk, her posture reflecting the kind of military bearing that had been drilled into her through years of training that went far deeper than basic enlisted instruction. She held herself with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to manage every aspect of her physical presence, from the angle of her shoulders to the rhythm of her breathing, while her mind conducted the kind of threat assessment that had become as automatic as breathing. "Lieutenant Foster," Blackstone began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of command presence. How long have you been assigned to Redrock Military Installation? 20 months, sir, Diana replied without hesitation. The answer was technically accurate, though it omitted the 8 months of preparation and cover development that had preceded her arrival, the careful construction of her false identity, and the ongoing mission that made every day on the base a performance of carefully calibrated deception. 20 months, Blackstone repeated, moving around his desk to stand directly in front of her, with the kind of deliberate positioning that military officers use to establish psychological dominance. And in that time, how many times have you been to this office? This is my first time, sir. Another accurate but incomplete answer. She had been in this office before, twice in fact, but those visits had occurred at 200 hours when the building was empty and the security systems had been temporarily compromised by her own electronic intrusion capabilities. She had spent those midnight hours photographing classified documents, copying hard drives, and installing surveillance devices that the base's own security personnel would never detect. Blackstone studied her with the calculating intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Your first time? Interesting. Most airmen, even exemplary ones, end up in the commander's office at least once during their tour, usually for recognition, sometimes for correction, but you've managed to remain completely invisible to the command structure. That's either extremely good performance or extremely careful anonymity. The observation was more perceptive than Diana had expected. During her infiltration training, instructors had emphasized the importance of maintaining what they called optimal invisibility, remaining competent enough to avoid negative attention while staying unremarkable enough to escape positive recognition. It was a delicate balance that required constant vigilance and perfect execution. I prefer to focus on my duties, sir, Diana said, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating through a minefield. I find that maintaining high standards in my work keeps me from requiring command attention. It was precisely the wrong thing to say. Blackstone's expression hardened as he heard what he interpreted as subtle arrogance disguised as military courtesy. To his experienced ear, she was suggesting that other personnel required command attention because they failed to maintain adequate standards, while she operated above such mundane concerns. It was exactly the kind of quiet superiority that he had dedicated his career to identifying and eliminating. High standards, he repeated slowly, his tone carrying the dangerous edge that experienced NCOs learn to recognize as the calm before an administrative storm. That's an interesting choice of words, Lieutenant, because I've been observing your work lately, and I have some concerns about your interpretation of those standards. Diana's training had included extensive instruction in reading human behavior, in detecting threats before they materialized, and in managing confrontations with people who possessed conventional authority but lacked understanding of her true capabilities. Blackstone was following a predictable pattern, building toward some predetermined conclusion through a series of leading questions designed to justify whatever action he had already decided to take. 3 days ago, Blackstone continued, beginning to pace in front of her with the deliberate movement of someone establishing territorial dominance. I conducted an inspection of your work area. Do you remember that inspection? Yes, sir. Diana's voice remained level, but internally she was analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression for clues about his intentions and psychological state. During that inspection, I asked you several questions about your work. Do you recall your responses? I provided technical explanations of the network maintenance procedures I was conducting, sir. Technical explanations. Blackstone stopped pacing and faced her directly, his pale green eyes reflecting the kind of cold anger that senior officers learn to weaponize through years of command experience. Is that what you call it when you lecture a general officer about computers, when you use technical jargon that you know he won't understand, when you make it clear that you consider his questions beneath your expertise? The accusation hung in the air between them like the smell of cordite after a weapons discharge. Diana recognized it as the moment when the confrontation moved from routine questioning to active hostility, when whatever grievance had prompted this meeting crystallized into specific charges that would justify predetermined consequences. "Sir," she said carefully, "I apologize if my responses seemed inappropriate. I was attempting to provide accurate information about systems that require precise technical vocabulary to describe properly." Her response was calculated to acknowledge his concern while defending her position, but Blackstone heard it as legalistic evasion wrapped in military courtesy. It was exactly the kind of response he expected from personnel who thought they could outsmart their superiors through careful word choice and bureaucratic maneuvering. "Precise technical vocabulary," he repeated with evident sarcasm. "Or perhaps you were demonstrating that you consider yourself smarter than the officers in your chain of command. Perhaps you think that because you work with computers, you're somehow exempt from the basic military courtesy that every other airman manages to display." Diana felt the familiar weight of maintaining her cover identity under stress that threatened to expose her true capabilities. For 20 months, she had endured countless instances of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated by people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades out of date. She had smiled and nodded while supervisors explained concepts to her that she had helped develop in classified laboratories. She had submitted routine reports to officers who couldn't comprehend the true scope of the operations she was conducting under their noses. Every interaction had been an exercise in calculated diminishment, a deliberate performance of incompetence designed to hide capabilities that could reshape the balance of global power. She had become an expert at appearing average, at seeming satisfied with routine tasks that utilized perhaps 1% of her actual abilities. "Sir," she said, and for the first time a slight edge crept into her voice. Despite her training in emotional control, "I have always conducted myself according to military regulations and professional standards. If my technical competence has been misinterpreted as disrespect, that was not my intention." The response was carefully phrased to acknowledge his authority, while subtly defending her position, but Blackstone interpreted it as exactly the kind of defiance he had expected. She was using military courtesy as a shield, while maintaining her position that his concerns were based on misunderstanding rather than legitimate command authority. "Technical competency," he said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that experienced personnel learned to recognize as the prelude to administrative consequences. "Let me tell you something about technical competence, Lieutenant. In the Air Force, your technical skills matter exactly as much as your ability to follow orders and show proper respect to senior officers. And right now, I'm seeing a lot of the former and very little of the latter." Blackstone moved back to his desk with the deliberate precision of someone implementing a plan that had been carefully considered and approved by his own sense of command authority. He opened the center drawer and removed a pair of military-issue scissors, the kind designed for field conditions where precision was less important than functionality. He placed them on the desk's polished surface with deliberate ceremony, like a judge laying down a gavel. "Military grooming standards," he announced with the formal tone used for delivering official policy, "are not suggestions. They are not guidelines. They are direct orders that apply to every person wearing this uniform, regardless of their specialty or their personal preferences." Diana stared at the scissors, understanding immediately what they represented and what Blackstone intended to accomplish with them. Her training had covered scenarios like this: how to endure personal assault while maintaining operational security, how to absorb humiliation without compromising mission integrity, how to preserve psychological stability when subjected to abuse by people who held conventional authority but lacked understanding of classified realities. What her training hadn't adequately prepared her for was the cumulative effect of 20 months of pretending to be someone she wasn't, combined with the shock of realizing that this general officer was about to physically assault her as an expression of his petty authority. The psychological walls she had built around her true identity, walls designed to contain months of suppressed capability and knowledge, began developing hairline fractures that threatened to expose everything she had worked to conceal. "Turn around," Blackstone commanded, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had never questioned his right to impose physical consequences on subordinates. "Face the window." Diana complied with mechanical precision, her movements reflecting years of military training, while her mind processed the rapidly deteriorating situation. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the flight line where maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for morning operations. F-35 Lightning fighters sat in their hardened shelters like technological marvels waiting to demonstrate American air superiority, completely dependent on the invisible infrastructure of communication networks, navigation satellites, and data links that she could manipulate at will. The irony wasn't lost on her. Those aircraft represented billions of dollars in advanced military technology, operated by pilots who had undergone years of specialized training, supported by maintenance teams with decades of combined experience. Yet their effectiveness depended entirely on electronic systems that she could disable with a few carefully crafted commands sent through networks that she had spent 20 months learning to control. She felt Blackstone's presence behind her as he approached with the scissors, his footsteps deliberate and measured on the polished floor. The morning light streaming through the windows cast shadows that moved across the flight line like dark omens, and Diana found herself focusing on those shadows to maintain the psychological distance she needed to endure what was about to happen without losing the careful emotional control her mission required. "Military grooming standards exist for a reason," Blackstone said as he positioned himself behind her, his voice taking on the lecturing tone that senior officers used when they believed they were delivering profound wisdom to subordinates who needed guidance. "They're not about personal preference or individual expression. They're about discipline, uniformity, and respect for the institution we serve." The first cut sent chestnut strands cascading to the polished floor like fallen leaves. Each severed section was a small violation that Diana absorbed with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. But beneath the surface calm, something fundamental was shifting in her psychological architecture. For 20 months she had built and maintained elaborate mental barriers between Major Diana Foster, the classified quantum warfare specialist, and Lieutenant Diana Foster, the unremarkable communications technician. Those barriers had allowed her to endure daily humiliations, to accept orders from people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades obsolete, to smile politely while supervisors explained concepts to her that she had helped develop in facilities so secret they didn't appear on any organizational chart. "Hold still," Blackstone commanded unnecessarily. Diana hadn't moved a muscle since assuming her position facing the window, but he interpreted any slight adjustment as potential defiance rather than natural human response to physical discomfort. The scissors moved through her hair with deliberate roughness. This wasn't a professional haircut designed to maintain military standards, but a crude assault intended to humiliate and assert dominance. Each cut went deeper than regulations required, removing more hair than any reasonable interpretation of military grooming standards would justify. Blackstone was making a statement, establishing a precedent, demonstrating that his authority extended to the most personal aspects of her physical appearance. "You know what your problem is, Lieutenant?" Blackstone's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was delivering a lesson that would permanently alter his subordinates' attitude and behavior. "You think being smart makes you special. You think because you understand computers, you're somehow different from every other airman on this base." More hair joined the growing pile at her feet. Diana could see her reflection in the window glass, becoming increasingly unfamiliar as the careful styling that had been part of her cover identity was replaced by something that resembled the aftermath of a field punishment. The woman staring back at her looked progressively more like a victim of arbitrary authority rather than a professional military officer maintaining her assigned duties. "Smart doesn't matter if you can't follow orders," Blackstone continued, moving to attack a different section of her hair with the same methodical cruelty. "Technical skills don't matter if you don't know your place in the chain of command. And your place, Lieutenant, is at the bottom of that chain, following the orders of people who've earned the right to give them." Diana said nothing, but her training in psychological conditioning was being tested beyond its designed parameters. The protocols that had allowed her to maintain operational security under normal stress hadn't anticipated the unique combination of physical assault, personal humiliation, and institutional betrayal that she was experiencing. Military officers were supposed to protect their personnel, not abuse them for imagined slights against their authority. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The scissors caught slightly in a section of hair that was thicker than the others, and Blackstone pulled rather than repositioning for a cleaner cut. The sudden tug against her scalp was sharp enough to draw blood where the metal scraped against skin. And for the first time since entering the office, Diana moved. It wasn't a flinch or a cry of pain, but a slight adjustment of her head position that removed her scalp from contact with the scissors. The movement was automatic, a defensive response that years of combat training had made instinctive when faced with potential injury from hostile contact. "I said hold still," Blackstone snapped, interpreting her movement as willful defiance rather than natural self-preservation. "We're not done here." He reached out with his free hand to grab her shoulder, intending to force her back into position for continued cutting. His grip was firm but not particularly forceful, the casual assertion of physical dominance that men like him had been using to control subordinates for decades. He had no way of knowing that his action would trigger responses that had been programmed into Diana's neural pathways through hundreds of hours of classified training in facilities that officially didn't exist. What happened next occurred faster than conscious thought could process. When Blackstone's hand closed on her shoulder, Diana's body interpreted it as a hostile grab from behind, exactly the kind of attack scenario that had been drilled into her through countless repetitions in close-quarters combat training. Her reaction was subtle but devastating, a slight rotation of her shoulder that broke his grip combined with a backward step that created distance while simultaneously placing her weight on his instep. To a casual observer, it might have looked like she had simply turned around to face him. To someone trained in combatives, it was a textbook demonstration of how to neutralize a grab while positioning for potential counterattack. The movement was so smooth and natural that it appeared almost accidental, but its effectiveness was unmistakable. Blackstone stumbled backward, surprised by the sudden reversal of position and the unexpected loss of control. The scissors fell from his hand, clattering against the desk before tumbling to the floor beside the pile of severed hair. For a moment, they faced each other across 3 feet of suddenly electric space, and something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. Diana's face remained neutral, but her posture had shifted in ways that suggested coiled potential rather than passive submission. The psychological walls that had contained her true capabilities for 20 months were developing cracks that threatened to expose training and abilities that no communications specialist should possess. "Did you just—" Blackstone began, his voice tight with disbelief and growing anger at having his authority challenged in such an unexpected way. "I apologize, sir," Diana said, her tone perfectly level despite the blood seeping from the shallow cut on her scalp. "I lost my balance when you grabbed me." It was technically true, but completely misleading. She hadn't lost her balance. She had demonstrated a level of physical training that no routine communications specialist should have received. But Blackstone, like most conventional officers, had never been taught to recognize such subtleties. He saw only that his attempt to assert physical control had been thwarted by someone who was supposed to be helpless under his command. The collision between his assumptions about military hierarchy and the reality of Diana's capabilities was beginning to expose secrets that were never meant to see daylight at Redrock Military Installation. As he moved toward his desk to summon security personnel who would escalate this incident far beyond anything either of them could control. Neither realized that the next few minutes would trigger revelations that would reshape everything they understood about authority, capability, and the true nature of the personnel operating within America's most classified military facilities. "Lost your balance," Blackstone repeated slowly, his pale green eyes studying Diana with the calculating intensity of someone reassessing a situation that had suddenly become more complex than anticipated. "Right." He moved toward his desk with deliberate precision, reaching for the secure phone that would connect him directly to the military police. One call would bring armed security personnel to his office, would begin the process that would result in formal charges, a court-martial, and the end of whatever career this insubordinate communications specialist thought she was building. But as his hand closed around the receiver, a soft chime echoed through his office, the distinctive tone that indicated an incoming priority communication through the base's most secure command network. The sound was so rare that many officers went their entire careers without hearing it outside of exercise scenarios. It meant that someone with extraordinary authority needed immediate access to the base commander, and that whatever they wanted to discuss was classified at levels that required special handling. Blackstone's hand froze on the phone as he glanced at the encrypted terminal, where a red indicator light pulsed with mechanical urgency. The display showed only a classification level, top secret CI shadow strike, and a request for immediate secure voice communication from someone identified as Oversight Prime. He had never heard of Shadow Strike as a classification compartment, and Oversight Prime wasn't a call sign that appeared in any directory he had access to. But the authentication codes were valid, the encryption was genuine, and the priority flags indicated that this communication took precedence over any other activity currently taking place on the base. Military protocol was absolute in such situations. When higher authority demanded attention, all other considerations became secondary. "Lieutenant," he said without taking his eyes off the pulsing indicator, his voice carrying a note of frustrated confusion. "Return to your duties immediately. We'll continue this discussion later." Diana remained at attention, her ruined hair framing a face that showed no emotion despite the blood still seeping from the cut on her scalp. "Sir, should I report to my first sergeant for additional corrective measures?" "I said you're dismissed," Blackstone repeated, already reaching for the secure handset. "Get out of my office now." Diana saluted with mechanical precision and left without another word, her footsteps fading down the corridor as the door sealed behind her with the soft pneumatic hiss of the building's positive pressure system. But as she walked through the headquarters building, something fundamental had changed in how she moved through the space. For 20 months, she had navigated these corridors with the careful anonymity of someone whose greatest asset was the ability to remain unnoticed. Now, with her hair brutally shorn and blood visible against her pale skin, she moved with a different kind of purpose. The psychological conditioning that had allowed her to suppress her true capabilities was developing fractures that threatened to expose training and abilities that no communications specialist should possess. Personnel in the corridors reacted to her altered appearance with the kind of carefully controlled non-reaction that military members learned when they witnessed something they weren't supposed to acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Williams from the communications squadron glanced at her and immediately looked away, his face showing shock that he couldn't quite conceal. Airman Rodriguez actually stopped mid-conversation when she passed, his eyes widening before he caught himself and resumed talking in lower tones. The base's social ecosystem was already processing the implications of her appearance. Someone who looked like she had been subjected to punitive correction was someone to avoid, someone whose association could bring unwanted attention from the command structure. But Diana no longer cared about maintaining the careful invisibility that had protected her cover for nearly 2 years. She made her way to the communications squadron with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout her infiltration. But her mind was no longer operating according to the careful protocols that had preserved her anonymity. Instead, she found herself analyzing her environment through the lens of her true capabilities, seeing vulnerabilities and opportunities that the carefully maintained Lieutenant Foster persona was never supposed to notice. The base's communication infrastructure was visible to her now in ways it hadn't been since her first weeks of infiltration. She could see the fiber optic cables running through the ceiling tiles, each one carrying data streams that she could intercept, modify, or destroy at will. The radio antennas on building rooftops were no longer anonymous pieces of equipment, but precisely mapped nodes in a network that she had spent months learning to manipulate. For the first time in 20 months, she was seeing Redrock Military Installation not as a place where she had to maintain a careful performance of incompetence, but as a target-rich environment where her true capabilities could be deployed with devastating effect. The realization should have terrified her. It represented a complete breakdown of the operational security protocols that had kept her mission intact for nearly 2 years. Instead, she felt something that had been absent from her emotional landscape since arriving at Redrock, a sense of her own power. Diana reached her assigned workstation in the communications squadron's main bay, a cramped space filled with computer terminals, diagnostic equipment, and the constant hum of cooling fans that kept sensitive electronics operating within acceptable temperature ranges. Normally, she would log into the network using her limited access credentials and begin the routine maintenance tasks that formed her cover duties. Today, her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she realized that she was no longer thinking like someone whose job was to fix computers. She was thinking like someone whose job was to break them, systematically, comprehensively, and in ways that would demonstrate capabilities that were supposed to remain buried in the deepest levels of military classification. The workstation beside her was occupied by Technical Sergeant Torres, a 15-year veteran who had supervised routine network operations at Redrock since before Diana's arrival. He had always treated her with the professional courtesy that senior NCOs showed to competent subordinates, never suspecting that her true capabilities exceeded those of anyone in the squadron. "Jesus, Foster," Torres said, looking up from his terminal with an expression of horrified fascination. "What the hell happened to you?" "Corrective action," Diana replied, using the euphemistic language that military personnel employed when they didn't want to discuss unpleasant realities. General Blackstone felt my grooming standards needed adjustment. Torres studied her ruined hair with the clinical detachment of someone trying to understand the scope of what he was seeing. "Corrective action doesn't usually involve—" He gestured vaguely at her head, apparently unable to find words for what Blackstone had done. "The general was very thorough in his feedback," Diana said, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest that further questions would not be welcome. Torres nodded slowly, recognizing the warning signs. In his years of military service, he had learned to identify personnel who were operating close to their psychological limits, and whatever had happened to Foster in the commander's office had clearly pushed her into dangerous territory. "Look," he said quietly, "why don't you take the rest of the day off? Get some medical attention for that cut. Maybe visit the base clinic and see if they can even things out a little." It was a kind offer, the sort of human consideration that occasionally penetrated the rigid hierarchy of military organizations. Under normal circumstances, it would have been exactly what she needed: time to process what had happened, to rebuild her psychological defenses, to restore the careful emotional control that her mission required. But these weren't normal circumstances, and she was no longer operating according to the parameters that had guided her for the past 20 months. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, logging into her terminal with movements that were faster and more precise than her usual careful performance of routine competence. "But I think I'd prefer to focus on my work. It helps me maintain perspective." The diagnostic programs she accessed weren't the routine maintenance utilities that comprised her normal duties, but deeper system analysis tools that required authorization levels Torres wasn't sure she possessed. As he watched, streams of data began flowing across her screen: network topology maps, traffic analysis reports, security protocol assessments. It was the kind of information that only senior system administrators typically accessed, and she was navigating through it with the fluency of someone who had been working with these systems for years rather than months. Something was very wrong, but Torres couldn't identify exactly what he was witnessing or why it filled him with growing unease. What he didn't realize was that Diana Foster had just begun the process of revealing capabilities that would fundamentally reshape everything Redrock Military Installation understood about security, authority, and the true nature of the personnel operating within its classified facilities. General Blackstone waited until he was certain Diana was gone, then activated the secure communication system with hands that trembled slightly despite his decades of command experience. The red indicator light pulsed with mechanical insistence, and he found himself staring at classification markings he had never seen before. Shadow Strike wasn't in any compartmented program directory he had access to, which meant it operated at levels beyond his security clearance. "This is General Nathaniel Blackstone, Commanding Officer, Redrock Military Installation," he announced into the secure handset. "I'm responding to priority communication from Oversight Prime." The voice that answered was female, crisp, and carried the kind of authority that came from dealing with matters so classified that most people weren't even allowed to know they existed. The tone was professional but carried an undertone of barely controlled anger that made Blackstone's stomach drop before she even identified herself. "General Blackstone, this is Director Elizabeth Kane, Defense Intelligence Agency, Quantum Warfare Division. We have a significant problem." Blackstone had never heard of the Quantum Warfare Division, but the fact that it existed under the DIA suggested capabilities and clearances that operated far above his level. The woman's voice carried the kind of calm authority that senior intelligence officials developed when they were accustomed to delivering news that would reshape someone's understanding of reality. "What kind of problem, ma'am?" Blackstone asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that involves one of my officers currently operating under deep cover at your installation. An officer whose identity was compromised approximately 12 minutes ago when your base security system detected an anomalous biometric signature in your office." The blood drained from Blackstone's face. Modern military facilities were equipped with sensors sophisticated enough to detect stress indicators, unusual behavior patterns, and physical trauma. If someone in his office had been injured badly enough to trigger medical monitoring systems, there would be an automatic record of the incident, along with biometric data that could be analyzed to determine exactly what had occurred. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I was conducting routine disciplinary counseling with one of my personnel, Lieutenant Foster from the Communications Squadron. There may have been minor—" "General," Director Kane interrupted, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "There is no Lieutenant Diana Foster assigned to your base. That identity is a cover for Major Diana Foster, United States Space Force, one of 12 officers worldwide qualified in multi-domain quantum warfare operations." The words hit Blackstone like artillery fire. He sank into his chair, staring at the pile of chestnut hair on his office floor with dawning horror. The implications cascaded through his mind like a series of controlled detonations, each one destroying another assumption about what had just occurred in his office. "She's been conducting a classified penetration exercise at your facility for the past 20 months, Kane continued with relentless precision. "Her mission involves capabilities that could disable every electronic system at your installation. The hair you just cut belongs to someone whose security clearance exceeds your own, whose mission is known to fewer than 30 people in the entire government, and whose operational security you have just catastrophically compromised." Blackstone's mind raced through the implications. If what this woman was saying was true, then he had just physically assaulted a senior officer conducting classified operations. He had humiliated someone whose real rank was equivalent to his own, whose true mission was so sensitive that even acknowledging it required authorization from the highest levels of the Defense Department. What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, damage control. Major Foster's cover identity has been maintained for 20 months through careful psychological conditioning and operational security protocols. Physical assault by her supposed commanding officer wasn't part of the scenario, and we don't know how it will affect her ability to maintain mission parameters." Director Kane paused, and when she continued, her tone carried unmistakable menace. "More immediately, we need to understand why a general officer decided to physically assault someone under his command. The biometric data shows clear evidence of hair cutting, physical restraint, and tissue trauma. Those are criminal acts, General, regardless of the victim's classification status." Through his office windows, Blackstone could see that normal base operations were continuing. Aircraft moved on the flight line. Ground crews coordinated their activities. The air traffic control tower managed incoming and outgoing flights. Nothing appeared different from any other morning at Redrock, but he now understood that his actions had potentially triggered a crisis that could compromise the security of the entire installation. "She was insubordinate," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Her attitude suggested disrespect for military authority. I was correcting deficiencies in military bearing. "General, are you familiar with the term conduct unbecoming an officer?" Kane asked, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded career-ending consequences. The question hung in the air like the smell of cordite after a weapons discharge. Blackstone realized that his career, 30 years of dedicated service, his reputation, his retirement benefits, everything he had built, was balanced on the edge of a precipice that had opened beneath him without warning. Meanwhile, in the communications squadron, Diana was accessing systems with a fluency that made Technical Sergeant Torres increasingly uncomfortable. Her fingers moved across multiple keyboards with the kind of fluid precision that suggested capabilities far beyond routine network maintenance. The screens around her displayed information flows that he had never seen before, complex data streams that seemed to map the entire base's electronic infrastructure in real time. "Foster," Torres said for the third time, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience was exhausted. "I need you to stop what you're doing and explain to me exactly what kind of system optimization you're performing." Diana looked up from her screens, and Torres saw something in her expression that made him step backward involuntarily. Her face showed no stress, no concern about the obvious irregularities in what she was doing. Instead, she displayed the kind of calm focus that he associated with surgeons performing delicate operations or pilots executing complex maneuvers under combat conditions. "I'm correcting inefficiencies," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. "For 20 months, I've been documenting systemic weaknesses in this installation's electronic architecture. Today seemed like an appropriate time to address those weaknesses." "Address them how?" Torres demanded. But even as he asked the question, he was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something far beyond his comprehension or authority to control. The screens around Diana's workstation began displaying network diagnostic information that seemed to update in real time as various systems throughout the base experienced subtle but measurable degradation. GPS receivers showing minute drift errors, communication channels developing barely perceptible static, data transfer rates declining by fractions of a percent. It was the electronic equivalent of background noise that sophisticated networks routinely compensated for. But Torres had spent enough years maintaining military communication systems to recognize the warning signs of systematic failure. What he was seeing wasn't random malfunction. It was surgical precision applied to the fundamental infrastructure that kept Redrock Military Installation operational. "Sergeant," Diana said without taking her eyes off her screens, "do you know what the most significant vulnerability is in any complex network? It's not the hardware, it's not the software. It's the assumption that the people operating the system understand what the system actually does." She gestured to the displays around her, which now showed cascading alerts from systems throughout the base. "For example, did you know that the GPS receivers used by our aircraft navigation systems are vulnerable to a specific type of signal injection that can be generated using properly configured software-defined radios, or that the encryption keys protecting our classified communications rotate according to predictable algorithms that can be reverse-engineered if you have access to traffic analysis over an extended period?" Torres felt ice forming in his stomach as he began to understand what he was witnessing. The quiet lieutenant he had supervised for nearly 2 years was systematically demonstrating capabilities that threatened everything Redrock Military Installation depended on for basic operations. As alarms began sounding throughout the base and communication systems started failing in sequence, Torres realized that the woman whose hair had been cut as punishment was proving to have capabilities that could silence the entire installation in ways that no one had imagined possible. The crisis began at 13:47 hours when every electronic system at Redrock Military Installation simultaneously experienced what the technical logs would later describe as cascading network failure of unknown origin. What started as subtle degradation quickly escalated into something far more serious as Diana's demonstration moved from theoretical capability to practical application. Air traffic control was the first critical system to fail catastrophically. The massive radar arrays that tracked aircraft within a 100-mile radius of the base simply stopped painting targets. The screens that had displayed the orderly progression of incoming and outgoing flights went blank, leaving controllers staring at empty displays while 17 aircraft remained airborne in increasingly dangerous confusion. "Tower, this is Falcon Lead," the radio crackled with the voice of Major Jennifer Walsh, flight commander of 4 F-35 Lightning fighters, conducting routine training exercises 50 miles northeast of the base. "Our navigation systems are showing impossible readings. GPS indicates we're currently over the Atlantic Ocean. Request immediate ground-controlled approach vector." The air traffic controller, Senior Airman David Kim, stared at his blank radar screen with growing panic. "Falcon Lead, we are experiencing technical difficulties with our ground-based radar. Stand by for alternative routing." But there was no alternative routing. The backup systems that should have activated automatically were also failing, their displays flickering between error messages and complete blackness. The emergency frequencies that connected the base to regional air traffic control were producing nothing but static. Even the weather monitoring systems had gone dark, leaving the tower crew unable to provide basic atmospheric conditions to aircraft that were now flying blind. In the Aerospace Control Center, a hardened bunker designed to survive nuclear attack, Colonel Rebecca Thorne was witnessing the systematic collapse of everything she had spent her career learning to manage. The massive wall displays that normally showed the comprehensive air picture for the entire western United States were dark. The satellite communication links that connected her facility to NORAD, the Pentagon, and Strategic Command had gone silent. "Colonel," called out Major Lisa Rodriguez from the operations console, her voice tight with controlled panic, "we've lost contact with all subordinate units. Missile warning systems are offline. Space surveillance is gone. Even the backup generators are experiencing power fluctuations." That last detail provided a crucial clue about what was happening. The backup generators operated on completely different electrical systems than the classified military networks, connected to mechanical controls rather than the computerized infrastructure that supported critical operations. If they were experiencing problems along with everything else, then whatever was attacking Redrock's systems was operating at a level far below normal network security protocols. "Get me a hardline to General Blackstone," Thorne ordered. "Use the emergency landline that runs through the mechanical telephone exchange." Rodriguez tried the connection, listened for a moment, then shook her head. "Nothing, ma'am. Even the old analog systems are dead." Thorne felt a chill of recognition. She had studied electronic warfare scenarios throughout her career, had participated in exercises where opposing forces attempted to degrade communications and navigation systems, but those scenarios always assumed that basic infrastructure would remain functional, that attacks would target military-specific frequencies and protocols while leaving civilian systems intact. What was happening at Redrock was far more comprehensive. Someone wasn't just jamming their communications or spoofing their GPS signals. Someone was systematically dismantling the electromagnetic environment itself, reaching into the fundamental infrastructure that supported all modern technology and methodically destroying it from the inside out. Meanwhile, in the communications squadron, Technical Sergeant Torres was watching Diana with growing alarm. For the past hour, she had been working at her terminals with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her fingers moving across multiple keyboards with precision that suggested training far beyond anything a routine communications specialist should have received. "Foster," he said, making one final attempt to assert normal supervisory authority, "I'm ordering you to stop whatever you're doing and step away from those terminals immediately." Diana looked up from her screens, and Torres saw something in her expression that made him understand with sudden clarity that whatever authority he thought he possessed in this situation was completely illusory. Her face showed the kind of calm control that he had seen in special operations personnel preparing for high-risk missions, the expression of someone operating with capabilities that exceeded anything he could comprehend or counter. "Sergeant Torres," she said with perfect military courtesy, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm operating under authority that supersedes your chain of command. What I'm doing has been authorized at levels you don't have access to." She gestured to her screens, which displayed real-time status updates from systems throughout Redrock. "For 20 months, I've been documenting the fundamental weaknesses in this installation's electronic infrastructure. Every vulnerability you're witnessing today has been mapped, analyzed, and prepared for demonstration. The question isn't whether I can disable these systems. The question is whether the people responsible for them understand how completely dependent they are on infrastructure they don't control." Torres stepped backward, finally understanding that he was witnessing something far beyond a routine security incident. The woman he had supervised for nearly 2 years, the quiet lieutenant who fixed computer problems and maintained network equipment, was systematically proving that she could bring down one of the most advanced military installations in the world. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him already suspected that the answer would redefine everything he thought he knew about military security and classified operations. "I'm the person who's been keeping this base functional for the past 20 months, Diana replied, her fingers never stopping their complex dance across multiple keyboards. "I'm the person who identified and quietly corrected 47 critical vulnerabilities in your networks before they could be exploited by actual enemies. I'm the person who prevented 3 separate attempts by foreign intelligence services to penetrate your classified systems." As she spoke, additional systems throughout the base began experiencing failure in sequence. The perimeter security networks that monitored the installation's borders went offline. The communication links that connected different squadrons and support units produced nothing but static. Even the base's internal transportation system, the automated vehicles that moved personnel and supplies between facilities, ground to a halt as their navigation systems lost contact with central control. Every GPS error, every communication failure, every power disruption you're witnessing can be reversed instantly, Diana continued with clinical precision. But first, everyone on this base needs to understand exactly how dependent they are on systems they don't comprehend, managed by people they don't respect, protected by security measures they don't believe they need. She pulled up a new screen that displayed the real-time positions of the F-35 fighters still circling overhead, burning fuel while their pilots struggled with navigation systems that showed impossible readings. Those pilots have 11 minutes of fuel remaining before they need to attempt emergency landings on highways. The air traffic controllers who are supposed to guide them to safety are staring at blank radar screens. The communication systems that should connect them to alternate airfields are producing nothing but static. Torres watched the displays with growing horror as he realized that the demonstration he was witnessing had moved far beyond theoretical capability. Real aircraft with real pilots were in genuine danger, and the woman responsible for their safety was proving that she could save or doom them with equal ease. "What do you want?" he asked, understanding that everything now depended on his ability to comprehend what was happening and respond appropriately. Diana's smile was cold and satisfied. "I want everyone to understand what I've understood for 20 months. I want them to realize that their confidence in their own capabilities is completely unjustified. I want them to acknowledge that the person they've been dismissing as an irrelevant technician is actually the only thing standing between them and catastrophic system failure. As emergency alarms began sounding throughout Redrock, and the full scope of the crisis became apparent to military personnel who had never imagined that such comprehensive system failure was possible, Torres realized that the quiet lieutenant whose hair had been cut as punishment was demonstrating capabilities that would fundamentally reshape everything the military understood about security, authority, and the true nature of modern warfare. The moment of absolute reversal came at 14:56 hours when General Nathaniel Blackstone received a communication that shattered his understanding of military authority, command structure, and his own place in the hierarchy he had spent 30 years climbing. The secure terminal in his office activated with an incoming priority message that carried authentication codes he had never seen before, originating from sources that operated at classification levels beyond his comprehension. General Blackstone, the voice belonged to Deputy Director James Morrison, Defense Intelligence Agency, Special Access Programs. His tone carried the kind of authority that suggested very senior rank and clearances that exceeded those of most cabinet members. I'm calling to inform you that Operation Shadow Strike has just transitioned from passive intelligence gathering to active demonstration mode. Blackstone felt his stomach drop as the implications began cascading through his mind like a series of controlled explosions. Sir, I'm not familiar with Operation Shadow Strike. No, you wouldn't be. It's compartmented above your clearance level. But since your actions have directly compromised the operation, you're about to receive a very comprehensive briefing on what you've been hosting at your installation for the past 20 months. The next 40 minutes destroyed everything Blackstone thought he knew about his own base, his own mission, and his own competence as a military commander. Operation Shadow Strike, Morrison explained, was the Defense Department's most classified response to the reality of modern warfare. While conventional military thinking still focused on kinetic operations, aircraft, missiles, tanks, and troops, a small group of visionaries had recognized that future conflicts would be won or lost in the electromagnetic spectrum. Major Diana Foster, Morrison continued with clinical precision, was one of 12 officers worldwide trained in multi-domain quantum warfare operations. Her capabilities included satellite network penetration, GPS manipulation, communication encryption breaking, and electromagnetic signature control. She could disable entire theater-level command and control networks, turn enemy navigation systems against themselves, and make military formations disappear from their own sensor coverage. The 20-month penetration exercise that Major Foster has been conducting at Redrock, Morrison explained with evident satisfaction, was designed to answer a simple question. Could a properly trained quantum warfare specialist operate undetected within a major military installation, gathering intelligence and positioning herself to disable critical systems if necessary? Morrison paused, and when he continued, his voice carried unmistakable satisfaction. The answer to that question appears to be yes. Major Foster has just demonstrated that she can bring your entire base to its knees using nothing more than standard computer terminals and 20 months of preparation. How is that possible? Blackstone asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because, General, you've been operating under the assumption that your systems are secure when they're actually held together with digital duct tape and institutional momentum. Major Foster identified 47 critical vulnerabilities in your networks during her first month at Redrock. She spent the subsequent 19 months developing exploitation techniques that your security personnel couldn't detect if their careers depended on it. Through his office windows, Blackstone could see maintenance crews running between buildings, their normal coordination disrupted by communication failures. Aircraft remained grounded because air traffic control couldn't provide safe guidance. Security patrols moved in confused clusters, unable to coordinate their activities or access the electronic locks that secured sensitive facilities. What makes this particularly interesting from our perspective, Morrison continued with deadly calm, is that Major Foster wasn't supposed to reveal her capabilities under any circumstances. Her psychological conditioning was specifically designed to allow her to maintain her cover identity, regardless of stress or provocation. The fact that she's now actively demonstrating her abilities suggests that something happened to damage that conditioning. Blackstone's voice caught in his throat as he attempted to explain. "Sir, I was maintaining military standards." Her attitude suggested insufficient respect for authority. "I took corrective action." "Let me guess, General. You decided that this quiet little lieutenant was showing insufficient deference to your rank. You concluded that she needed correction, so you took it upon yourself to teach her a lesson about military discipline through physical assault." The accuracy of Morrison's assessment felt like a physical blow. Blackstone realized that every action he had taken, every justification he had constructed, was being dissected by people whose understanding of the situation exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. "I was enforcing grooming standards," Blackstone said weakly. "Military discipline requires—" "Military discipline," Morrison interrupted, "requires understanding what you're actually dealing with before you decide how to respond to it. You physically assaulted a senior officer, conducting classified operations, compromised 20 months of intelligence collection, and triggered a demonstration that has just proven how vulnerable your installation really is." At that moment, Blackstone's office door opened without warning. No knock, no request for permission. Someone had simply walked into the inner sanctum of base command, as if security protocols no longer applied. The woman who entered was immediately recognizable, despite her brutally shorn hair. Major Diana Foster moved with fluid precision that Blackstone now understood indicated capabilities far beyond routine communications maintenance. She carried multiple tablet computers that displayed real-time status information from systems throughout the base, and her expression showed the kind of calm satisfaction that came from demonstrating complete mastery over complex systems that others couldn't comprehend. "General Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound more threatening than overt hostility. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Behind her, Technical Sergeant Torres entered with the expression of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy was fundamentally wrong. His face showed the peculiar mixture of awe and terror that people developed when they realized they had been working alongside capabilities that could reshape the balance of global power. "Sir," Torres said, his voice tight with stress, "Major Foster has just restored partial communications and navigation systems throughout the base. She did it in about 30 seconds using her tablet computers. I thought you should know that the person who received corrective action this morning appears to have capabilities that go significantly beyond routine network maintenance." Blackstone looked at the woman whose hair he had cut, seeing her now not as an insubordinate junior enlisted airman, but as someone whose true authority exceeded his own in ways he was only beginning to understand. The power dynamic had reversed completely, and the carefully constructed assumptions that had guided his entire military career were crumbling like a house of cards in an earthquake. "Major Foster," Morrison's voice came through the secure communication system. "Please provide a comprehensive status report on Operation Shadowstrike's current phase." Diana activated her tablets, and their displays appeared simultaneously on every functional screen in Blackstone's office, a demonstration of her complete control over the base's electronic infrastructure that made even the most secure communication systems seem vulnerable to her influence. Operation Shadow Strike Penetration Phase completed as of 1456 hours, she reported with military precision that carried undertones of grim satisfaction. 20 months of intelligence gathering have documented 247 distinct vulnerabilities in Redrock's electronic warfare defenses, communication protocols, and navigation systems. All critical systems have been mapped, analyzed, and prepared for either defensive hardening or offensive exploitation as mission requirements dictate. As Blackstone listened to her report, he began to understand that what he had intended as a simple lesson in military discipline had instead triggered the exposure of secrets that would fundamentally reshape everything the Defense Department understood about security, vulnerability, and the true nature of modern warfare. 6 months after the incident that would forever be known in classified circles as the Redrock Revelation, Major Diana Foster stood before a joint session of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in a hearing room so secure that its existence wasn't acknowledged in any public records. The transformation in her appearance was striking. Her hair had grown back to regulation length and was styled with professional precision that suggested someone who had learned to present herself as both approachable and formidable. But the real transformation was in her role within the Defense Department's evolving understanding of modern warfare. Operation Shadow Strike had expanded from a 12-person experimental program to a full-scale operational division with installations at 63 military facilities worldwide. The vulnerabilities that Diana had identified at Redrock had proven to exist in various forms throughout the entire defense establishment's electronic infrastructure, triggering the most comprehensive security overhaul in military history. "Committee members," she began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had proven her capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. 6 months ago, I was an unknown major conducting classified operations at a single Air Force base. Today, I'm briefing you on a program that has fundamentally altered how the United States military approaches electronic warfare and cybersecurity. Senator Patricia Walsh, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward with the expression of someone who had spent months reviewing classified briefings that had challenged everything she thought she knew about national security. "Major Foster, your written testimony indicates that the vulnerabilities you identified at Redrock exist throughout our military infrastructure. Can you explain to this committee exactly how extensive these problems are?" Diana activated a secure tablet that projected classified displays onto screens visible only to committee members with appropriate clearances. "Ma'am, during the past 6 months, my teams have conducted penetration exercises at 63 installations worldwide. In every case, we successfully mapped critical vulnerabilities, identified attack vectors, and demonstrated the ability to disable key systems without detection." The data she displayed painted a sobering picture of American military vulnerability. Air Force bases where GPS manipulation could ground entire squadrons, Navy installations where communication jamming could isolate ships from their command structure, Army facilities where network penetration could compromise operational security for entire theaters of operation. "The fundamental problem," Diana continued, "is that our security protocols were designed to counter conventional threats, foreign intelligence services, terrorist organizations, criminal hackers operating from external networks. They weren't designed to address the possibility that sophisticated adversaries might insert trained operators directly into our facilities." Representative James Morrison, whose oversight had coordinated the initial response to the Redrock incident, studied the classified displays with evident concern. Major, are you telling this committee that foreign powers could be conducting the same kind of operations that you demonstrated at Redrock? Sir, I'm telling you that the techniques I used are well within the capabilities of Chinese, Russian, and Iranian intelligence services. The only difference is that my goal was to identify and correct vulnerabilities, while their goal would be to exploit them during actual conflicts. The implications were staggering. If foreign operators could infiltrate American military installations and position themselves to disable critical systems, then the technological superiority that the United States had relied on for decades could be neutralized before the first shot was fired in any future conflict. Diana's response outlined a comprehensive transformation of military security protocols that went far beyond traditional approaches to base protection. First, implementation of multi-domain quantum warfare training for senior officers at all levels. Military leaders need to understand not just the capabilities of their own systems, but the ways those systems can be compromised by sophisticated adversaries. She pulled up additional displays showing training programs that had already been implemented at select installations. Second, establishment of red team penetration exercises at all critical facilities. We need to constantly test our security assumptions through realistic scenarios that replicate the techniques actual enemies would use. Senator Walsh nodded slowly. Major, your personal experience provides a unique perspective on this issue. Can you tell us about the psychological challenges of conducting long-term covert operations within military facilities? For the first time during her testimony, Diana's professional composure showed slight cracks. Ma'am, maintaining a cover identity within the military requires suppressing every instinct and capability that makes you effective at your real job. For 20 months, I had to pretend to be less intelligent, less capable, and less aware than I actually was. The psychological toll of that performance is significant. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The incident with General Blackstone wasn't just about inappropriate discipline. It was the culmination of 20 months of being dismissed, underestimated, and treated as insignificant by people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades obsolete. When someone physically assaults you while lecturing you about military discipline, the disconnect between their perception and reality becomes impossible to maintain. Representative Morrison consulted his classified briefing materials. Major, what happened to General Blackstone? Sir, General Blackstone was court-martialed and convicted of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and obstruction of classified operations. He was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 24 months confinement. He's currently serving his sentence at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. The fate of Nathaniel Blackstone had become a cautionary tale throughout the military officer corps, a general whose career had been destroyed by his inability to recognize that the quiet major he was attempting to discipline possessed capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of modern warfare. More importantly, Diana continued, his replacement, Colonel Rebecca Thorne, has become one of our most effective partners in implementing the security improvements that Operation Shadow Strike identified. Redrock Military Installation is now one of the most secure facilities in the Department of Defense, specifically because leadership there understands what they're protecting against. Senator Walsh checked her secure tablet, noting that their allocated time was nearly exhausted. Major Foster, if you had to summarize the most important lesson from your experience at Redrock, what would it be? Diana considered the question carefully. Ma'am, the most important lesson is that in modern warfare, Appearances can be completely deceiving. The most dangerous enemies don't necessarily look dangerous. The most capable allies don't necessarily appear capable. And the most critical vulnerabilities aren't necessarily obvious to people who think they understand their own systems. She stood, gathering her classified materials with the same precision that had characterized her work at Redrock. The military that wins future conflicts will be the one that best understands the invisible battlefields of electromagnetic warfare, cyber operations, and quantum information dominance. Physical courage and conventional tactics will always be important, but they're no longer sufficient. Diana's voice carried the authority of someone who had proven her point in the most dramatic way possible. 6 months ago, a general officer tried to teach me a lesson about military discipline by cutting my hair. What he actually did was demonstrate that our military's understanding of its own vulnerabilities was dangerously incomplete. My job now is to ensure that no future commander makes the same mistake. As the committee session concluded and members began filing out through security checkpoints that scanned for everything from recording devices to quantum encrypted implants, Diana reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning in Blackstone's office. She was no longer the invisible major whose true capabilities were hidden beneath layers of classification. She was now one of the most senior officers in the Defense Department's newest and most critical operational division, someone whose expertise was sought by military leaders worldwide who were beginning to understand that the next war would be fought in domains they were only beginning to comprehend. The hair that had been brutally shorn as punishment had grown back, but the secrets that had been revealed in the process had fundamentally altered how the American military understood its own vulnerabilities and capabilities. In the end, General Blackstone's attempt to demonstrate his authority had accomplished something far more significant than he could have imagined. It had forced the most powerful military in history to confront truths about modern warfare that it hadn't been prepared to acknowledge. And it had elevated someone whose quiet competence had been dismissed to a position where that competence could reshape the future of national security. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.